Welcome back to the Parental Alienation Conference for Australia and New Zealand, or known as ANZPAC. My name is JD. I'm from Parents Beyond Breakup. And this month, we are coming to you live from Adelaide, South Australia. I have the privilege of introducing our first guest online, Crystal Montaldo, who is a family dispute resolution practitioner, child inclusive practitioner, and also a lawyer with extensive experience in domestic violence and family matters. So, Crystal, we're really looking forward to hearing about the correlation between some of these domestic violence matters and parental alienation. Crystal, welcome.
Thank you, JD. Thank you for letting me be here today.
Oh, thank you, Crystal. I know that you have practiced in law, you've practiced in mediation, but in your time practicing in law, you've done a lot of work in community legal services. So you've seen both sides, working both with mums and dads, dealing with the domestic violence sector, with family sector. I'd like to bring it back to the core theme of this conference series and ask you straight off, how would you define parental alienation?
Yeah, thanks for that question, JD. So, look, we can, on paper, we can look at parental alienation as simple as, a child rejecting one parent due to the influence or behaviors of another. However, I guess in my experience as a practitioner, I've seen it and I feel that it is more of a set of behaviors that have been perpetrated by a parent towards a child that are behavior traits that are isolating, manipulating, denigrating, and even controlling a child's reality. Behaviors that I would say quite literally resemble coercive control behaviors. So it's an interesting question in terms of what is parental alienation, because I feel like it is one of those spaces that it does really borrow from a lot of different jurisdictions and spaces, but doesn't actually have its own unique framework in itself. I mean, to clarify, yes, I do feel like those behaviors are part of parental alienation. However, when we look at it from a legal standpoint, um, it's not defined as domestic violence. It can't be, not in the legislative climate that DV works in. And that's particularly because DV, for example, at least in the state that I'm in, which is Queensland, doesn't recognise a relevant relationship as a parent to child relationship. So doesn't fit within the DV framework. One would think then parent to child relationship, maybe it is child protection. And well, while there is definitely elements of psychological abuse there, we're not necessarily seeing protection agencies intervening in alienation cases. They're not banging down the doors of every perpetrating parent trying to protect the alienated child. So it's not necessarily that space either. When we look at it from a therapeutic space, so the DSM-5, for example, doesn't define parental alienation as a type of syndrome, so it's not there either. I think the DSM-5 does have like a child affected parental relationship distress sort of,
That's right. Yeah.
but
Yeah.
it's not parental alienation, so it is a little bit different, right? Um, and then you move to, okay, well, it's not DV, it's not child protection, it's not really, a psychiatric diagnosis. So what about the family law? Because that's where we see it. Unfortunately, there's nothing really in the Act that expressly defines parental alienation either. So I guess what I'm trying to say here, and in my answer to your question, is it doesn't fit neatly into a specific box. It draws from a lot of these different areas. Yeah, and we're in this space where that gap and that lack of definition, that lack of framework around it right now, what I think it is, quite honestly, is dangerous. And particularly in cases where there is entanglement with domestic violence. I used this definition early on and linking it back to coercive control. I did that because, you know what, 10 years ago, coercive control wasn't really recognized publicly, wasn't recognized legislatively. Yeah, as practitioners, we knew about it and it was in the courts, don't get me wrong. But alienation is just as dangerous. It's similar behaviors, and if not, it's even worse because it's that parent-child relationship, because there's a particular element of vulnerability there. Um, at its core, a child is experiencing a form of harm here, and the system just quite honestly hasn't built a box for it yet. So.
So, as a legal practitioner, as someone who works in mediation to assist families pre court, you work in child informed practice as well, so you get to have direct impact with the children.
Yeah.
And in that context that you just mentioned around coercive control, we're coming live out of Adelaide in South Australia today. Legislation has just passed here in South Australia around coercive control. We've seen that in a lot of states around Australia. New Zealand has similar. Can I ask you, as a practitioner with those multiple hats, what's your position on parental alienation?
Yeah, look, I think it's like I said to you, I think it's really quite it's real and it's really quite dangerous. Especially when it's entangled with that family law DV in the family law courts in that DV space. So drawing back to like recent studies like the ACE study, the Australian Institute of Family Studies, for example, they had a look at the contested parenting matters in the family courts. And there was often, quite a lot of the time, allegations of parental alienation alongside domestic violence allegations. And those two things generally were seen hand in hand. Um, I guess that study demonstrates how frequently the two intersect. And so in terms of my position there, I I feel like there's a real danger of these two elements, I guess, or two problems that we're having in community being misidentified. Um, what I see professionally and in my career, what I have seen is there is usually one party that has allegations of domestic violence and another party that has allegations of parental alienation, and there's all this noise trying to, I guess, in the court space or even in the mediation space, um, where everyone's trying to figure out what's actually going on, but no one's actually paying any attention to the child or allowing their voices to shine through. Um, Look, I'm going to say something a little bit controversial, but
Yeah, go for it. Yeah.
and I just, not every parental alienation allegation is parental alienation, and not every domestic violence allegation is DV. And I say this in a way that's not trying to take away from anybody's experiences at all. But essentially, reasonable rejection does exist for children. Parents can be protective when there is domestic violence, but people can also misuse the system and misuse their position in a child's life as well. Um, More importantly, all of these things can exist at the same time. So in matters. So the risk of misidentification is generally quite huge. And there's no clear framework at the moment. So I feel like the mislabeling here is quite common. And in the court space and definitely in the therapeutic space as well. The risk that we run if we misidentify in this space really between I guess the spectrum of DV and parental alienation, um, is children can be forced then to have unsafe contact with parents, or conversely, have a safe parent cut off by them, and that tie wrongfully severed. So the outcomes here for kids are quite catastrophic if we don't really get this sorted. Um, I guess also from a systems point of view as well, misidentification between parental alienation and domestic violence can really harm some of the systems that these families are using at the moment. Um, we end up with when we've got all these multiple allegations flying around in these court spaces, we end up with burnt out police, overworked court staff, judgments that might not align with what is in the best interest of the children. And most importantly, well, not most importantly, but a big part of it as well is also draining the shreds of humanity that's left in a lot of these frontline staff workers as well. So, it is one thing to also remember that the system is built by people and it's formed by people as well. And I think, for example, if we take the DV reforms context, there's been a lot of legislative progression in that space, as you've mentioned. But also, I think there's a lot of files in the system that probably don't necessarily belong there that have been misidentified. And this leads to a bit of a hamburger factory mentality, where people are in and out and they're saying that, the system's broken. And yeah, the system might be a little bit broken and we're trying our best to fix it on this side of the fence, but quite honestly, I think sometimes the way that it's been used is broken too. Um, so to answer your question, I guess the bottom line here is there's a lot of ambiguity in this space, particularly when it's mixed in with domestic violence. And I think really until we can separate the protective behaviours from the alienating behaviours, we really run the risk of producing some insecure children and unsafe children in our society, and left only working with fragments of a system that's not really working because it's been minimised.
That's interesting. We had a police inspector at last month's ANZPAC, and he was alluding to similar things around the system just can't handle, and the frontline professionals that are dealing with this system just can't handle the onslaught. But what's interesting in what you just said there, Crystal, we did our own internal research with the audience that are listening and watching this right now. And we asked a series of questions in some very short form research, and we saw early signs of a correlation between, we'll say, claims of parental alienation and claims of domestic violence. Now, I'm saying claims because they have to be tested in court, of course. But did I just hear, and I'm not putting words in your mouth, but did I just hear you saying that the ones that really need the help, it's getting watered down because the system is so overloaded? Is
Yeah.
it a fair call to say that potentially in some cases that these allegations or claims are being weaponized and we're missing the support of the children caught in the middle? Is that a fair comment?
Yeah, absolutely. It absolutely can be weaponized. Like I said, it can go both ways, don't get me wrong. But I've definitely seen it in cases in the DV space, in the family law space, where these sorts of allegations, we're still operating on a level where we're looking at it from an adult viewpoint. We're looking at it not with the lens of the children. We're not incorporating the children into the space enough. And I know you can't do that in domestic violence, don't get me wrong. I'm not trying to say that, but um, because it's this, it becomes a little bit of a, I guess, I don't want to say tit for tat, and I don't want to say, but it can be that battle that happens in court.
Yeah.
We're literally taking away from the needs of the child, and the result of that is, yeah, everything becomes weapons. It's not just the DV system. It's not just parental alienation. The whole everything becomes weaponized. And then on top of that, these people that are in the system are relying on, professionals in the space as well, who potentially might not be informed about the sorts of things that are going on that parental alienation level, and not trauma informed or not supported enough in that space to be able to assist in the appropriate ways.
Wow. Okay. Well, look, thank you for the insight, and I'm sure that when you're referencing the burnout, that you've probably seen that with court staff and other professionals
Yeah.
along the way in your career. I know some of the areas you've even served in community legal, where the system gets overloaded. But Crystal, I'm aware that there is some research to some of this, and I'm also aware through Parents Beyond Breakup that there is future research to dig deeper and to look into these correlations, particularly where there is proven parental alienation. But from your perspective professionally, can you give us some ideas of what you think may need to be changed? Because it sounds like the entire system's not coping, and it's got different parties at war with each other. And you mentioned 5 or 10 minutes ago, what about the care for the child? Um, have you got any thoughts on what needs to change or what's required here?
Yeah, I think we need to have a framework that probably encompasses some better diagnostic tools. So, to distinguish the difference between protective behaviors and alienating ones. I think we need to adapt some therapeutic tools from like other places, to be able to, I guess, adapt it into this space as well and be able to utilize it. I think one of the next things is I working in this profession for a decade. I can attest to the fact that I think that with the legal profession is still, after all these years, we're breaking free from it, but we're still operating relatively in a silo. And I speak again for those practitioners that are day in, day out in court, churning files. The the legal profession itself, doesn't have a multidisciplinary approach to these things. There's no holistic approach. There's no working with other fields here. And I think that both the practitioners and the court need to shift away from that space more and more. And the courts are doing that to some extent, don't get me wrong. But, for example, my own personal or professional transformation, like when I segued from a lawyer to, because I'm primarily a legal practitioner, but when I segued into that FDR space, it was so transformative for me because, I'd always worked in a community space where we used a lot of therapeutic tools, and we were quite trauma informed in our approach with our clients. However, it was like I leveled up when I got to the FDRP stage because for me, I was able to utilize all the tools of this therapeutic space and still apply it in a legal space as well. And it was gold. That's where I'm seeing outcomes for clients, being able to have that holistic approach. So I think a big part of that is the silo stuff. I mentioned education as well. I mean, when I talk about again my own professional career, when I went to law school, there was one subject for family law electives. It was family law, and it was elective. It wasn't a mandatory course. I did 5 subjects, and any lawyer that's on this will know 5 subjects of property that has left my brain 15 years back. But I had one course of family law. There was nothing in that course that I think, unfortunately, that I could have taken back into and utilized in my taken and utilized in my professional career. So education is a big thing as well. I think, yeah, at a university level and also ongoing professional education in this space as well. Um, Structured therapeutic supports for children in family law matters. Reunification therapy is there in parental alienation matters, but it's not very realistic and accessible. Therapeutic supports are generally dependent on, private funding. So I would love to see a way for some structured, accessible therapeutic support built into the system for children. That would be great. My last two probably recommendations would be, or last two suggestions of what I think could change is child inclusive practice for mediation on a mediation level. I think that there is a lot of value where appropriate, and subject to a suitability assessment. It has. I've really seen some changes in anecdotally, at least in my career. And I think that it's often put in the too hard basket, and it's underutilized. So I would love to see, and this is a bit of a radical change, but I would love to see it be an opt out rather than an opt in. So when not suitable, when it doesn't meet the criteria for, and rigorous, obviously, suitability assessments would be needing to occur, that it's an opt out then, but that we're really directing all of our families into that child inclusive space, because that is where I've seen in my career the most change. And getting in there earlier. So yes, like when we talk about having the child's voices heard in court and all of that stuff, that's all well and good. But a lot of the time when we're in that court space, it's entrenched, and it's quite problematic in that space. So if we're doing some of this stuff earlier on into the process, that's really going to protect children, I think, in the space. When we are in the court space, I guess, I don't feel like, I know there's been a lot of legislative changes around children's best interest factors and ICLs being the requirement for them to meet, the child now. But I'm still not hearing or seeing the child in the room in the court, metaphorically, of
Interesting.
course. But I'm not feeling that there's been that much of a change in that space. Yes, and I think it's going to be some time before we see those changes really implemented, like the outcomes of those changes in the court. But I would like there to be some more ways for the child to be. We need to be consistently thinking about their experiences, understanding them, and trying to hear them, not just meeting with the ICL on one occasion as a bare minimum. There needs to
Yeah.
be a shift in that space.
And I
Yeah,
think we heard it here first, the opt out of child inclusive. That's that's going to open up a whole other conversation. Crystal, I've got one more question for you, and I just want to acknowledge we have a series of questions already coming through from what you've said. So you've definitely provoked some thought. I'll remind our audience online, please use the link that's in the chat, and for our audience in Adelaide, please use the QR code that's on the screen in front of you to submit your questions. Shape this conversation that we're having with Crystal right now. We'll do our best to answer your questions in a moment. Crystal, before we get to the audience questions, can I just get one or two quick thoughts on what our audience can actually do right now? And considering that our audience is made up of both mums and dads, parents and grandparents that have experienced some of these family traumas, might I say, and we also have professionals. I'm looking now, we have family lawyers, we have some psychologists, social workers, so we've got a mix. From your perspective, what are some things that the audience can do right now in this space?
Yeah, I think we need to be reframing our focus to the child, and trying to actively um, sort of like return to that child's perspective, how they're experiencing what's going on, what are they feeling? I think, that's going to be the overarching thing I think we can do right now immediately. When I and you know and I'm saying this from a parent perspective as well. So, when I do this, how does my child see that? What are the impacts of my behavior on my child? And conversely, when they're behaving like this, what does that actually mean for them? So, really sort of bringing that focus back onto the child. If you're experiencing or you're in a space where you think there might be some parental alienation, I would be looking at documenting patterns, not just incidences. So, looking at behavior patterns, not just one-off events. What's the child's reaction to the parent's response? Try and obtain some clear insight, see where what pattern is forming there, so you can try and identify that a little bit better, because an isolated incident isn't going to really tell you much outside of context, and particularly when you're in a court space that doesn't have a framework. Particularly, case law, and there is some reference to parental alienation in the Family Law Act, and not not a reference, I would say, but there's a protective framework in there to combat parental alienation. But we want to make this as clear as possible, when you're in that court space. So if you can do things like documenting patterns, I think that would be useful. In terms of complex cases in the courts, and this is going to sound a bit controversial, but maybe there's a need to slow some of those cases down. Not necessarily dragging them out, because that's going to be that's also can have a harmful impact on children. But is there any non-legal supports that we can, or not like non-legal avenues that we can take while this matter is in court? I get that court takes years, and I get that the system is inundated. I'm the one that's singing that sort of song in this session today, but also rushing people through the system when they need scaffolding is not going to help families either. And an element of that is also coming from the parents to be able to take some accountability as well and engage in supports, non-legal supports. It's not as simple as you're going to get an outcome in court just because there's a judge. What steps can you take yourself to be able to actively engage in those therapeutic spaces? I think
Interesting. Listening to what you shared already, Crystal, I know we're both in Australia, but we have the audience overseas. We just got a comment live from New Zealand saying, "Bravo, Parents Beyond Breakup. You are leading the way, hearing from all of these experts. Love the leadership. Think we need this in New Zealand." So for our Kiwi audience, we are coming to New Zealand next month. We will be in Auckland. So there's a heads up. But the reason I wanted to share that live, Crystal, is the reactions that we're getting from not just even in Australia, that this is relevant. These key points on looking for the patterns of behaviour, starting to look from the child's perspective. If you've got one or two more quick thoughts, then we'll dive in, because there's a flood of questions coming in for you. You've sparked some great thought in this space, and there are more comments saying, "Thank God we're having this conversation." So yeah, we'll get your final thoughts on what else the audience can do, and then we'll jump into their questions.
Yeah, I guess to wrap up, there's only really two things. So protecting the integrity of the system is just as important So I mentioned that earlier, that the system is just as broken as sometimes the way that we use it. Misusing it undermines its credibility. So that goes back to that weaponizing those behaviors, makes the system less useful, and it takes away from people who really need it as well. So that's one thing that I would say, where we can, let's protect the integrity of that system so we can work on strengthening it rather than diminishing it. And I guess I think the key takeaway I also want people to think about is, I don't want you to think about PA as a binary sort of space, or DV. It's not two individual things. There's a lot of crossover and intersectionality, and I think it can be true that they can coexist in matters. So our role is to kind of sift through all that noise so we can really start to identify what's happening for that child, and bringing them back into the space. Because the reality is little Sally down the road isn't going to say, "Hi, my name is Sally and I'm alienated." Or Josh over there isn't going to say, "Hi, my name is Josh and my parents beat me." What they are going to say is, "I'm scared, I don't want to go, and I hate them." And we as professionals, as people helping these families, we must look to interpret these statements and help these children, and sift through all that confusion so they can be set up in a better space. We want more secure children in our community, more secure and safe children, and this is the way that we're going to start doing it in this space.
What you've just said there is consistent with one of our other guests, Barrister Darren Mort, was calling for more voice of the child, but not just in the court, in other ways, in therapeutic ways, and for us to actually read and hear what they're saying. So thank you. There's comments flooding in from both Australia and New Zealand, Crystal, and you've given some very pragmatic points there, and for us to further consider as we take this journey with ANZPAC to actually get to real change. I'd like to put some questions live from the audience to you, if I can.
Yeah, sure.
We're getting a lot of engagement on this particular topic. The first one comes from one of our. It's a parent who is online, and this parent's asking, why does the system fail to report child abuse as mandatory reporters? For example, solicitors, social workers, judges, politicians, and court reporters. I know that's probably more of a controversial question, but we want to give voice to this. So what's your view on that?
Yeah, and I think that there is a lot of competing interests to balance here in this space, particularly with that issue. Because when you think about legal professionals, right, for example, they're also subject to ethical standards and legal privilege. That's also that's an important element there that we need to be aware of, dancing on that line of legal integrity and working in the space as a legal professional, and the fact that those conversations are covered by privilege. So a lot of the time, legal professionals, there are exceptions to the rule, are not mandatory reporters because they've got legal privilege. Then you look at it from a not a legislative space, sorry, a judicial space. And I have for sure seen the judiciary refer matters to the Department of Child Safety for it to be reported, generally by the ICL, particularly if there's any disclosures made in a family report, for example. So I have seen that happen. It doesn't happen too often, because there's competing interests that have to be balanced in that space. So in the legal space, I can understand why it really comes down to the complexity of the matter and the complexity of the space itself. In terms of those more therapeutic roles, yes, we do have legal obligations to report. We are mandatory reporters when it comes to things like this. As an FDRP, I'm constantly thinking about what allegations of violence that I have to report to the Department of Child Safety. But what we have to look at is, do I have, when I'm hearing these allegations, do I have particular incidences that are reoccurring? Is that enough to meet the screening of the department, or am I just reporting something that's going nowhere? I want to make sure that I'm giving this child the best opportunity I can to be
Right.
to be able to be screened and to be able to be assessed in that space. And if I'm reporting a minimal DV behavior or minimal child abuse behavior, there is a chance it's not even going to reach screening and it's going to go nowhere. So we have to think about what's the best way to do this that's going to get the best outcome for the child. So it's not just as simple as yes, we do have to report. We're looking at this holistically. The flip side is if it's allegations and actually the abuse didn't occur, for example, and people are weaponizing this space like they do because it does happen, we're also reporting then to the department against a person who potentially hasn't done anything that then adds onto their file that can have a negative impact on them. The other side to that, or the other element, is the department is a beast of a place, don't get me wrong, but it's also just as under-resourced as every other element in this space. So it in the, and I said this earlier, in the grand scheme of things, when we're looking at that child protection space, I'm not seeing docs workers knocking down the doors of uh, perpetrating parental alienating parents to try and, remove children from that space. It's just not happening because there's not enough resources. There's other things that are going on as well in that space that the docs, like the department's looking at as well.
So again, this is sparking a flood of questions. I will encourage our online audience to use the link in the chat. And for our audience there in Adelaide, please scan the QR code on the screen in front of you to ask your questions. I'm afraid we're probably not even going to get through all of them, but we will bank these up and we will return to these questions. And we'll put the questions that we don't get to all of our experts at the end of this year. We have another question off the back of what you just said right in live, Crystal, from New Zealand. So this is a parent in New Zealand who's watching online. How does a mediator in Australia deal with a parent who's likely alienating and refusing to acknowledge it? So how do you see, if you put your mediator hat on, how does a mediator deal with that?
Yeah, look, I've definitely had those matters. And it's really difficult because particularly in spaces where we've done child inclusive with the child, so we've had a session with the child, we have understood the behaviors that the child's exhibiting aligning with parental alienation. So, a parent that has literally traveled across the other side of the country just to be around his kids, and the kids are not wanting to engage with him because of that alienation that's happening. So it's definitely been something, it's a tricky space to manage in the mediation space because a lot of the time it's not appropriate for us to be able to mediate. So those matters generally end up becoming inappropriate. We issue a Section 60I certificate, and we're hoping that they have the right scaffolding in the court space to be able to be supported through with an outcome that's going to be beneficial for that child. Because on a therapeutic level in the FDR space, other than child inclusive, again, because there's no real framework for parental alienation anywhere, we're not able to actually do much. We're able to investigate. We're able to find out that, yes, there is parental alienation. But when assessing it, whether or not it's appropriate to mediate, parental alienation is telling me that there's entrenched conflict. Parental alienation is telling me that there is one person that will have an inability to participate in good faith for the sake of their child because they're not behaving for the sake of their child right now, for whatever reason it is. So a lot of the time it's inappropriate, which is really disheartening.
Wow. Okay. Thank you for just shooting straight. I really appreciate the insight from your experience on the ground dealing with these cases. And I do acknowledge that what you said earlier, that it's not easy for professionals. It's as parents, we can project and blame some of the professionals, but I think you're giving us insight on how difficult it is to navigate and see what's actually happening. It probably leads to this next question, which is from one of our online audience. This person is a professional. They're asking, in your view, is the domestic violence statistics increasing? So they're specifically relating to emotional and verbal abuse, so psychological abuse. So are domestic violence statistics increasing as a result of parental alienation or these family conflicts?
That's an interesting question because, I think that it's multifaceted. There's so many different components when we look at the statistics around domestic and family violence, like the history of underreporting, the increase of education in the community. There's a lot of things that would attest to the stats just overall just now increasing. in terms of, I can only speak anecdotally to my, my experience in the profession. Um, I feel like there is a correlation there. I definitely do feel like it is there, but for what particular reason or why, like I wouldn't be able to give you that answer. But yeah, I don't disagree with that sentiment.
Yeah, thank you. And look, I realize I'm putting you on the spot there, but I think that's the dialogue that's starting to evolve as we dig deeper into this.
Mm, mm.
Um, we do have a parent professional in the room in Adelaide who's asked the next question. Do you see a future where parents who alienate or make false allegations could possibly be charged due to creating, constructive or adverse child effects?
I think we're a very long way away from that. Um, Yeah, I don't think we don't even have a framework at the moment. Whether or not it would get that far, I'm not too sure. I think that we need to start with even being able to identify it first, being able to have it create a space for parental alienation first, before we can even look at whether or not that is going to be something that happens in future. I mean, one thing that I didn't anticipate was when they started legislating things like stealthing in the criminal code, at least in Queensland. So that surprised me that that happened. So I can't predict the future, I guess,
Well,
but
tell us about that. What did you see starting to change within that?
with the stealthing stuff,
Yeah, yeah.
I think it's education. I think there was a lot more education around that sort of behavior actually happening and people not realizing that actually, that whole misinformed consent even existed. So it was very interesting and very forward, I thought, forward thinking of legislation to be able to incorporate that in the criminal code. So yeah, so in criminal legislation, it was very interesting.
That is fascinating. Gosh, we could do an entire other conversation just on that. Um, the questions are still flooding in. I'm going to do my best. We've only got a few minutes left before we cross back to our next guest. But this question might talk to several of your roles. And this is coming from a parent who is viewing online.
Hmm.
What are the behaviours seen in children when one parent is using alienation and it's been proven in court? So, in that sphere of coercive control, is there any kind of reactive abuse that would be seen in the kids?
Um, yeah, I think it's very similar to when I was describing the coercive control behaviors and looking at it being like, oh, this could be domestic violence, but it could be child abuse and it could be parental alienation. So it's the same similar sorts of behaviors that you would be seeing. It's just framed differently because of the context. Of the parental alienation or the behaviors of the parents, I should say. So, a good example that I could give you, I had a family a while back that I mediated, and dad he had done all the right things in terms of separation had occurred. He'd relocated to be closer to the children. And some of the sorts of he'd reach out to try and spend time with the children. The children were teenagers at this point, and some of the stuff that he was met with was, like F you, I don't want you, I hate you, I want nothing to do with you, like I don't want to spend time with you. And then, initially when I engaged with this family, mum was like, well, I can't force them. They're adults, like not adults, they're teenagers. Like, what am I supposed to do? But the more that we started to unpack that situation, the more that we understood the context behind a lot of that commentary, and that actually it wasn't just this child not wanting to engage with their dad. It was them actually deeply wanting to have a relationship with their father. But in fact, um, the way that his behavior was coming out was aligned with the need to protect his mother because that's the narrative that he was fed. You know,
Right.
yeah. And so I really don't necessarily think that there's a specific set of behaviors. So I might have said that early on, but just didn't provide context. But it really does come down to that context of that family functioning and what that looks like.
Okay. Um, I'm gonna do my best to squeeze in one or two more. We've got a comment/question from a professional in the room saying that there are frameworks for parental alienation. So when you referenced that with your legal hat on before, are there no frameworks visible to the court practitioners, to the lawyers around how to navigate this process?
And I think that there are there's case law and there's obviously the 60cc factors. And so there is, yes, I probably jumped in there a bit too excited. So there is stuff there, but I think in terms of like um, parental alienation being quite well articulated in the space or even in the pre-court space, in that therapeutic space, I like my view is that it's probably not clear enough then for at least, or there's not enough education in the space around it because I've seen a lot of practitioners that have just minimized it completely in practice.
Okay, well, thank you for sitting in the hot seat, Crystal. There for the audience, Crystal has no idea what questions are coming through. This is purely live, and we really appreciate your candor and taking the difficult questions. But also, thank you for giving us insight into some possible things that can be done in this space, Crystal. It is loud and clear that having the child's voice heard is coming through from what you've seen, and I think I've heard you today talking about let's be careful we don't blur the lines. That yes, there are correlations, but the cases that are needing real help for the children or people experiencing real domestic violence may be getting lost in the volume. So you've really got us, you've got the audience really rethinking how do we approach this in a different manner. Crystal, we want to say thank you so much for giving your time. I know how busy you are. Thank you for joining us online. Have you got any final thoughts before we cross back to our next guest in Adelaide?
No, I think this was a very good experience. So I appreciate being able to take the time to express my views today and interacting with the audience. Thank you.
Crystal, thank you so much. We really, really appreciate it. And to our online audience and our audience there in Adelaide, please keep the questions coming. If we didn't get to your question, we will be putting it to all of our experts before the end of the year. Again, Crystal, thank you. For our online audience, we'll ask you to stay with us. We're going to take a quick intermission break while we switch over and we cross live back to Adelaide for our next guest. We have the Honourable Sarah Game, MLC, standing by for our next interview. So please stay with us. We'll be having a short break for about 2 minutes, and then we'll be coming to you live from Adelaide in South Australia.